Welcome. Thank you for coming to the New School. I want to say thanks to the New School for helping host this series of talks on Latinx art. My name is Rocio Aranda, and I'm formerly the curator at El Museo del Barrio. We're joined by the director of El Museo here, Patrick Charpenel. And I just wanted to let everybody know, even though the galleries at El Museo are closed, there are two exhibitions that you can see currently. There's one at Hunter East Harlem. The show is called Queenie, and it's a survey of women artists from the museum's permanent collection. And there's another exhibition at Ostos Community College at Longwood Art Gallery that's there. And it's a show called Revival, and it's about pattern and decoration and contemporary art. And it features artists from all over the Caribbean and Latinos from the US also. So tonight we have a really esteemed panel. I was really excited to put this series of talks together. Steaming panel. After being inspired by the 2016 Ford Foundation Symposium, The Future of Museums and Latinx Art, I think was the title, and that was really conceived by Teresita Fernandez, who thought about the growth of the Latino population in the United States and the lack of attention that it continues to miss in mainstream museums and larger institutions. And so this series sort of thought about how we can begin to discuss Latinx art as American art. And I thought it was important to think about an earlier generation of artists who were practicing in well, we could start with the 50s, 60s, 70s, but this is really looking at the 70s, 80s, 90s, artists who were working at the time and how we can maybe incorporate them into this larger narrative of American art history, or let's say US art history. I'm not going to introduce the speakers individually because you have excellent bios of them in your program. This is going to be the order where it'll start with Deborah Cullen, followed by Yasmin Ramirez, followed by Perla de Leon, followed by Shawn Noriega, and finishing up with Freddy Raviga. And I have a little timer here for everybody so that we keep to track on time. And we have last talk was really great, really at the end to have all the Q&A, the time for Q&A, which is really important. So please help me welcome first Deborah Cullen.
Lucy, I'm not going to adhere strictly to your timeline, sorry.
Time is up.
No, I mean the time of the 70s, 80s. I'm going to go back a little earlier, but that's okay. So as we consider the Pre-Latinx Veteranos, in my brief time here at the podium, I want to point quickly to a few artists whom I was privileged to work on or with over the years, primarily at El Museo del Barrio, where I served for 15 and a half years very happily, who I think remain often considered Latin American and not necessarily part of American art at all. And while certainly they hail originally from birth nations outside of the US, they have retained ties to them and contributed immeasurably to art here in the United States in various ways, leading to a tremendous legacy here. So for these reasons, I want to nominate them to the pantheon of Latinx artists. So first, Antonio Frasconi, born in Buenos Aires, Argentina in 1919 to Italian immigrants. Frasconi and his family soon moved to Montevideo. By age 19, he was already publishing his works. In 1945, he received a grant from the Art Students League New York, and thereafter was based in the United States from 1945. By 1946, he was exhibiting already his moving and politically committed woodcuts, including at the Brooklyn Museum of Art. In 1947, he traveled to Mexico to work with Los Tres Grandes, returned to New York, and made lithos and relief prints at the Workshop of Graphic Arts in Union Square and Robert Blackburn's printmaking workshop. Among his many awards and honors are a 1953 Guggenheim Foundation Grand Prize at the Venice Film Festival in 1960 for his film using more than 100 woodcuts. The artist has had numerous international exhibitions, including representing Uruguay in the Venice Biennale of 1968. Frasconi was a crucial teacher and served as a distinguished professor of the arts at Purchase College, State University of New York, where he taught since 1980. Regrettably, Antonio Frasconi passed away in 2003. I have little quotes there that I think sort of spoke to the conflicted status. Next, I want to talk about Marisol. As Frasconi contributed to printmaking in the United States, I think Marisol contributed immeasurably to pop art. Born in Paris in 1930, she spent a year at a boarding school in Long Island as early as 1941, visiting New York often with her internationally traveling family. Her father, after her mother's passing, her father moved her and her brother to Los Angeles at age 16 in 1946. She became a U.S. citizen in 1963, but represented Venezuela, in the 1968 Venice Biennale also, as the same year as Fasconi. She unfortunately died in 2016. Marisol's a unique voice in post-war art. Her work resists any simple classification, but her combination of pop, social critique, and craft was approvingly accepted but benignly overlooked until Marina Piccini's survey in 2015 with El Museo del Barrio thankfully presented. She also had this ongoing dialogue with Latin American forms, including retablos, ex votos, that I think was sort of less understood. And she sort of participated in the ABEX generation's sort of scavenging of so-called primitive sources as she was moving in those circles in early New York. She was a leading pop artist who inflected it with her own unique style. Carmen Herrera. Next, I want to talk about Carmen, who certainly was very important to abstract hard-edged geometric abstraction. Born in Havana in 1915, in the early 1930s, Herrera completed her studies in painting at Marymount College in Paris, returned to Cuba in 1935, pursued architectural studies at the Havana University, participated there in Havana's cultural life, and then when she was 23, married and came to New York in 1939. There she took classes for 2 or 3 years with the painter John Corvino at the Art Students League. She found that New York did not live up to her expectations, especially for a female Latin American artist. And then she returned to Paris, where she lived and worked from 1948 to 1954, where she started doing her first black and white hard-edged geometric abstractions, coincidentally at the same time that Ellsworth Kelly did. She returned to New York in 1954 when abstract expression was at its apogee, so her work was sort of generally overlooked. Her benign neglect led her to work in solitude. She had a show in 1984, which was reviewed by the New York Times. And then she had a focus survey of her black and white works, curated by Carolina Ponce de Leon at Museo del Barrio in 1998, which I was fortunate to also contribute to, which was the first sort of beginning of her re-entry to the scene, leading to her recent celebration at the Whitney Museum in 2017 at the ripe old age of 102. Carmen Ramos, the Smithsonian curator, noted that she is still referred to as a Cuban-American artist, and her work's acceptance follows a number of high-profile Latin American geometric abstract surveys, which have established this work as a market force. Nonetheless, she has been, I think, a leading hard-edge abstract artist. I want to just make a little parentheses here. I want to bring up Olga Albizu to your attention, a remarkable abstract expressionist artist who's been long overlooked, I think. Albizu was born in 1924 in Ponce, Puerto Rico. She studied painting with Miguel Poe at the University of Puerto Rico and with Esteban Vicente, also in Puerto Rico, from 1943 to 1947. Received her BA from the UPR in 1946 and moved to New York in 1948 for fellowships also at the Art Students League, where she worked with Hans Hofmann, Karl Holte, Vaclav Wittlichil, and others. She studied further in Paris and Florence. By 1956, her paintings were being used for record covers for RCA and Verve's jazz and bossa nova albums, including the very famous Getz Gilberto in 1964. She returned to New York in 1958, where she remained for decades. She did not return to Puerto Rico until after her mother's death in 1980, and unfortunately she passed in New York in 2005, with the exception of a lengthy scholarly article by Abby McEwen. Her work is sorely in need of a retrospective, I'm just saying to the younger scholars here in the crowd. The wonderful Luis Chemnitzer. Chemnitzer, a German-born Uruguayan artist and academic, was born in 1937 and has been based in New York since 1964. His Wikipedia entry, which I looked at this morning, says that he is the leading conceptual artist of Uruguay. Interesting. He is a leading conceptual artist.
And upstate New York.
And of upstate New York, I would say. He is a leading conceptual artist, period, who with Liliana Porter and Jose Guillermo Castillo founded this short-lived but very influential New York graphic workshop. He's focused on political subjects, including identity, language, freedom, ethical debates, historical tragedy. He's been influential in printmaking, especially, but also sculpture and installation. He's also an important pedagogical figure, as I said, an academic. His writing is crucial to our genre, and his most excellent essay, Wonder Bread and Spanglish Art, which I looked at again this morning, I urge you to all read it, was an expanded version of an essay Chemnitzer wrote in 1988 while he was trying to theorize this very topic, the hybrid production of US-based artists, which we could easily have just read that here tonight, as Chemnitzer defined in this pre-Latinx age. He called it Spanglish art, which he defined as Spanglish represents the merging of a deteriorating memory with the acquisition of a new reality distanced by foreignness. I think that's really a beautiful quote. Yay, I just got my last. Last but certainly not least, the wonderful Rafael Ferreira. Rafi was born in San Theresa, Puerto Rico in 1933. He attended high school in Virginia at the Staunton Military Academy from 47 to 51. He attended 2 years of Syracuse University from 51 to 53, where he started drumming and playing in musical groups. He drove to Los Angeles in 1953 with his brother, the actor Jose Ferrer, and Rosemary Clooney, Jose Ferrer's wife. He returned to Puerto Rico in 53, where he studied with Eugenio Fernández Granel, the Spanish surrealist. He then traveled to Europe, met Wilfredo Lam in the early 50s. He didn't return to university. He lived in Puerto Rico for a while working as a professional musician. He moved back to New York in 1955, where he worked as a professional musician and visited museums and kept painting and kept making art. He returned to Puerto Rico in 1960, kept playing drums with small bands in various hotels and working, and decided to fully commit himself to art in 1966 when he moved to Philadelphia. He has lived in New York continuously since 1966, although he's had sojourns in the Dominican Republic. He currently lives in Long Island. He's in his 80s and still working, still ornery. He's produced a substantial and diverse body of work since 1951, as you see, continually in conversation with the United States. He's a leading, I would assess his work as he was one of the leading post-minimalist artists in Leo Castelli's circles, as well as a key neo-expressionist painter in the 1980s. And he's chosen to embrace his hybridity. He's a Puerto Rican-born, US-based artist equally critical of both places. And this seems to have been something that comes out in his work early in his career. You probably all know the famous quote. Robert Morris warned the artist, "I don't want to see you concerned with being Puerto Rican." However, when Ferreira met Lucas Samaras, the artist counseled, "Put more Puerto Rico into it." So I want to close with something Rafi told me when I was asking about his relationship to Black artists. I did an exhibition on his work in 2010, and then a monograph for UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center AVER series in 2012. Rafi said he was talking about his relationship to Black artists, including Mel Edwards and Benny Anders, and I was sort of asking him about that and how that worked with the Puerto Rican artists and the Black artists, and what was his relationship to American Black artists. And he said, quote, "We were all brothers sharing a particular reality, aware of what was really going on, but when you're in it, you're traveling through the world like a knife through butter. You know your strength, and you know that we are not against each other. We are allies in a situation that is ongoing, but we're not making alliances in order to deal with it to get ahead. We're just part of a scene, and each one has to deal with it in their own way." Ferrer then sardonically referred to this as the pre-Hispanic era. He's acknowledged the fact that ethnic specificity was not yet a label or tool by which groups could join forces and leverage for cultural representation. So I'll close with that. Those are just a few people I'd like to nominate to the pantheon of Latinx art.
Hi, so welcome everyone, buenas noches. I warned Rocio, who's one of my best friends and a buddy from graduate school, that I was going to unpack and push back against the title of this panel because I'm not so comfortable with the whole wording of pre-Latinx, the Veterano avant-gardes. Why not? Firstly, the term Veterano. We don't really use that term here on the East Coast. I've never heard any of the artists refer to themselves from the generation of the 60s, 70s, or 80s as veteranos. Rather, what I've heard them call themselves are Nuyorican. They use the term Latino. But my preference is the term that young people have applied to me. Coming up in the 70s and 80s, which is an OG, which is an original gangster. That is how I like to think about, these artists as part of the OG generation. Secondly, one of the reasons why I don't care for the term veterano is that it really reminds me, it evokes what happened to us in graduate school when we were at Columbia and when we were at the Graduate Center of the City of New York, which is that our professors made a very strict distinction between the quote-unquote historical avant-gardes up to, let's say, the 1950s and contemporary artists. And why did they do that? And why did I not, why did I feel so strongly that I didn't want to accede to that generational distinction? And it was primarily because we're talking the 90s and it's multiculturalism, and they were using that idea of the historical avant-gardes as paradigmatic of revolution and of being able to work outside of the box. And so for us, it would be that artists of color cannot claim the same radicality. That's the way it was used in terms of what I was studying, is to kind of blunt claims of originality and radicality. And I always will remember Hal Foster in a class telling me there is no outside, meaning there is no such thing as an alternative art movement, and that the best we can do as critical thinkers is to point the limits, look at the limits and the margins of what can be done, but to try and really create revolution that's over. So that's another reason why I don't like this distinction. Now we're going to go to the pre-Latinx. No, do not like that. That doesn't make sense to me. I'll tell you why. Well, it's because that prefix means pre-existing to Latinx, and my preference is to think of these artists from the 60s, 70s, 80s as proto-Latinx, meaning original. The original Latinx who were creating and doing actions that were nascent and unnameable at that time, but as a result, after a generation or two, people began to really get it into their heads, and so of course a new terminology like Latinx has to arise. But it's to me like this terminology comes after the fact of actions and original work by artists, which are articulating things that we can't say. That's why we need art to give us ideas of what we can't articulate yet, right? And in terms of what Latinx means to me, right now, it's very much a terminology which promotes gender-neutral, LGBT, trans, friendly, pan-ethnic, intersectional approach to exhibiting and discussing Latino identity and culture. So with the time remaining, I just want to talk about 4 artists who are still active and producing. That's the other thing why I don't like to call them historical, because many of our artists are, thank God, they're still alive and they're still making work, and very valid work, like Ferreira, right? I mean, Ferreira had a show about 4 or 5 years ago. It was astounding that he is still producing masterpieces. So let's not count them out as a prior. They're existing. So the first artist I just want to talk about quickly is Papo Colo and the late Jeanette Ingerman. May she rest in peace. And why I want to discuss his work, it's more of his work as a curator and the founder of Exit Art, which was in existence in New York from 1982 to 2011. And that was the home base for the most radical exhibitions. That's Papo, that's Jeanette Ingerman, and that's one of the last exhibitions that they did, which was chronicling the history of alternative art movements in New York. So what I want to say is that it was the home base for the most provocative vanguardist shows in New York. And what made Exit Art so important for us is that Colo and Jeanette Ingerman exhibited a copious amount of Puerto Rican / Latino, Latinx artists alongside African American, Asian, Native American, Euro-American artists in massive bi-monthly group shows that addressed urgent sociopolitical issues and emergent cultural manifestations that everyone could get behind, and it was a place where you could really meet and discuss intellectual issues and look at some of the best new art that was in New York, and he promoted so many wonderful young artists. And just to give you an idea of some of the exhibitions that really made an impression on me was Illegal America, The Hybrid State, which is when I first got to see someone like Guillermo Gomez Peña perform. That was very, very influential for me. The L Factor in 2002, which I would say was probably the first, Latinx show primarily because it really did bring together a group of young artists who were not calling themselves Latinx, but were paying attention to the intersectionality of race, class, gender, and expressivity. And the last show is, of course, the Alternative Histories show, which happened in 2010. And it put on display the full spectrum of artist-run galleries, alternative galleries in New York that included many Puerto Rican and Latinx spaces that had been ignored by mainstream historians and critics. Second, to nobody, but second on my list just because, is of course Dr. Marta Moreno Vega, a great mentor to many of us in the field. She is, of course, a second director, institutionalizer of El Museo del Barrio, the co-founder of Association of Hispanic Arts, the founder of the Caribbean Culture Center, and also a daughter of Obatala. So what can't she do? What can't she do? What power is that, right? Incredible artist activist, voices from the battlefront, and very much creating space for the exhibition for the exhibition and also the intellectual space for Afro-Latina women. But there is a limit to who she is and what she could do in the 1970s and early 60s, and this is a very rare example of her artwork, which is in the Radical Women's Show here in New York. It was not in LA, but it is here. And I think that there's a great deal of vulnerability in this piece. Although she is dressed in kind of a sort of a pantsuit, that 70s pantsuit that women were doing so much. There's a great deal of vulnerability. Hanging from her neck are her two children, her two boys, who she would take regularly to El Museo. And what I want you to think about, if you do go see this piece, is in 1973, this was an Afro-Boricua museum director and artist. That was like unheard of, right? And she did this job with such strength. And yet her artwork, when she was allowed to kind of express herself, reveals a vulnerability. I can't go into it more, but you should see it. That was very surprising and beautiful for me to experience, because I know Marta as someone I don't want to mess with ever, ever, ever. Okay? Now, next up is someone who worked with Marta, very well known to you, Nitza Tufino. And you can see in this piece, this is a detail of a collage. This is her in 1973. So this is a piece of both of them in 1973. She's also wearing, these little overalls, and she's in front of her mural, which she painted for the Art Heritage of Puerto Rico show. Of El Festival de Loíza, which is this festival that happens in the most black part of Puerto Rico. And this is part of a series that Nitza started making it around 2011, which was a kind of a biographical series. And what it documents is her transition, really, from being the daughter of one of the most famous and revered artists, Rafael Tufino, in Puerto Rico, and a mom of two grown children, to the wife of Ronnie Bellini. So her decision to marry another woman and really claim a lesbian identity at this time has changed her work tremendously. She's producing so many great things. And so, again, this is a rare example. I mean, we all know that there's a lot of lesbians in the Puerto Rican artistic community, and there's a lot of gay people, but they're not out with it. So for Nitza at this late stage to really be out with her love and to be renewed by this kind of liberation that she's had later in her life is wonderful for me to see. And I did exhibit this piece. It's about 24 in this series. And last but not least is Luis Calle. As I've said, being an out gay or lesbian artist in Puerto Rico is still rather, it's getting better, but it's not so accepted. It certainly wasn't as accepted in the 80s. So one of the great things about Luis Scarle when he came here in 1984 to study as an artist, and this is right at the beginning of AIDS, is that he took it upon himself to document the existence of the gay Latino community in New York. This is the AIDS quilt. He's taken a lot of pictures of demonstrations. And this is in particular a photograph that was recently bought by it entered the collection of the Smithsonian of Sophie Rivera, which is one of the people who is credited with initiating the Stonewall Revolt, who is a transgender Puerto Rican woman. So there's a lot of history that he's recording that has yet to be really widespread within our community, the Latino community, as well as within the gay community. And also, Luis is a founder of an organization called OP Art, which was founded in 1992, largely, but not exclusively, of gay artists. And this is the last Sopro Criollo. There's Luis in the middle. And a lot of these are members of the OP Arts community. And I had the wonderful opportunity to work with OP Arts when they did a great exhibition in Puerto Rico. And lastly, Luis was the curator of a new LGBT festival called Fuerza Fest 2 years ago. And yeah, 2016, we're finally doing an LGBT festival in El Barrio, hooray. And at that time, it was called Fuerza Force Latino Arts Festival. And this year, it is being, I don't know, how can I get this? No? I can't, can I can click, oh, okay. Just gonna do it quickly, get you all to come. This year, it is being curated by Richard. Oh, that's too bad. Anyway, by Richard, who is part of the education department here at El Museo del Barrio. And it's called Fuerza Fest Latinx LGBTQ Festival. So he added the X being of this generation. But in the end, what I really just want to conclude with is that I'm hoping that the X is also going to be open to this notion of intergenerational collaboration within the Latino community, which exists and which I think makes us stronger and better artists and art workers. Thank you.
I'm going to show you a 5-minute video that I put together of a series I did, my goodness, 40 years ago in the South Bronx, when New York City was going bankrupt in 1975. The way they resolved the near bankruptcy issue is they decided to close over 50 firehouses, but only in poor communities. The vast majority in the South Bronx and in Brooklyn. And of course, that meant many dozens, actually 600 fires that eventually would occur. So I'll show you the series that I did with a CEDAR grant, which was a, comprehensive, it was similar to the WPA grants.
It was Community Education and Training Act.
But they were grants they gave to arts to work in distressed areas or schools. And I was teaching pinhole photography to the children in this neighborhood. And every time I would step off the train, I thought I was in a World War II movie, because I grew up on a lot of old black and white movies, and I was like, how could this be 10 minutes from the wealthiest community? The Upper East Side at the time, now we have a lot of wealthy communities in New York City, but back then, pretty much it was the Upper East Side that was your very wealthy community, and this was 10 minutes away. So I'm going to show you this, and then I'll tell you a little bit about what sadly 40 years later is kind of a repeat. I'm distributing solar lights in Puerto Rico, and I'm documenting all these communities where neither the US nor Puerto Rico is doing anything very constructive. So I'm focusing, you will see destruction, but I'm also focusing, like I did a little bit here, on the activists and the artists who you kind of give up on the government and then you do the own thing. So I focused on solar lights that many people still need, And I'm going to be focusing on people who have invented streetlights that are solar and sustainable farms and many other things. So there'll be like devastation, but hopefully also some very inspiring things.
Mhm.
Let's see. Whoops. Sorry, guys. Okay, so that was the subway that you saw that I would get off to go to the school. The most famous streets are Fox Street and what was the other one? There were two of them. Simpson were the two most famous. So I have a lot of friends that grew up there. This is my bicycle route that the kids would take. And you're listening to a soundtrack which was the beginning of hip hop. The beginning of hip hop was really wonderful. This is, I call my little man. I played baseball with kids after school. I was amazed that they could ignore all of that and just have a really great game. This was a lovely, a little diary that a young lady wrote about how beautiful her neighborhood was, and that she couldn't believe that the last tree was taken and the last store where you could buy the famous pickles, and mentioned all of the different nationalities that lived there. Because even though it was a poor working class, it was fairly mixed. It wasn't, it was predominantly Puerto Rican and African American, but they did have a large mix of people, and the food and restaurants. She was just devastated by how nothing was left. The kids were playing hide and seek. That little girl that you see on the mound there, that's at the Smithsonian now. This past year, they bought 12 of my photographs from the series. And this was just a young woman going to work in the morning, little girl playing tic-tac-toe. The lights are a little light here, so I don't know if you'll see it. There's always shortcuts that kids would take to get to a store, because stores were really far now, especially pharmacies for the elderly. I used to feel bad when someone forgot the bread or the milk, because it meant traveling quite a distance. And this was a little boy who would always say, "Good morning, teacher," on our way up to, this is Charlotte Street, infamous Charlotte Street. All the presidents stood there and said, "Oh, we're going to fix things soon and it's going to be fine." This again is Charlotte Street. It was so bad that the kids prefer to walk in the street than to walk on the sidewalk, because there was so much garbage and glass. I remember once getting almost run over by a sanitation truck because they backed up and they threw all of their garbage onto the street near where those two little children were walking. And I started taking photographs and cursing them. I said, "Why are you doing that? You wouldn't do that in another neighborhood." But they wouldn't even go to the depot. They would just throw it right there. I kind of regret that I wasn't a journalist. I'm kind of dyslexic. I have a hard time writing, because I would have written a lot about that. And then this was a little park across the street, which was the one area that didn't look really devastated. But now that Puerto Rico has gone through its bankruptcy, and sadly the two hurricanes, I feel like I'm going to be doing the same thing, except that I'm moving towards installations. So I'm not sure what the final result is going to be, but it will be obviously the devastation that has happened there, and trying to focus with some music on the people that are really doing some great things and have just given up on working with either government because they're kind of useless. I mean, sadly, what we saw on television, where you would see trailers at the ports, millions of dollars of supplies never left there. And when they left, you're not sure where they left, which is really sad. But they have a great spirit, so I'm sure I don't want to just deal with the devastation. I'm sure I'll come up with both images and music and some activism kind of component that I want to do that I can't tell you because it's illegal. So if we get arrested, that gives us the free media that we can't afford. So, well, that's kind of in the direction I'm going, but it's sad that 40 years later, I'm covering again bankruptcy, a Puerto Rican community under bankruptcy and stuff. The book that I was making at El Museo del Barrio, they exhibited 42 of the images from this series. It's about a 60-image series. And so many people asked me for a book because they were raised in the Bronx and felt that it was the only time they saw dignified, photographs of dignity, and not just that these kids burnt down the houses, which was a crock of... I discovered a professor in Columbia University. She and her husband studied for 15 years the whole situation of the bankruptcy, and it turns out that only 7% of the fires were caused by children and landlords who were collecting insurance, which leaves you with 93%, and you're going, well, what's the other 93%? And they explain that the Rand Institute, which used to give false statistics about Vietnam War and how many people had died, they were the ones that were hired to decide how to solve the bankruptcy in New York, and they were the ones that came up with, let's just close all these firehouses. So of course, if you have if your grandma's stove catches fire, by the time Yonkers reaches, reaches the community, it was just fire after fire. But I loved that hip hop and the explosion of salsa that traveled all over the world, that there was so much creativity. They didn't necessarily get the financial benefit out of it, but there was so much creativity and positive, the young lords did great things, and that's all going to be in the book. I was doing the South Bronx and Vieques, but now because of Puerto Rico and the bankruptcy, the book has expanded, so I'm glad that I couldn't publish it yet, because it'll be bankruptcy to bankruptcy, and all of the positive things that people did in spite of the destruction. Thank you.
Thank you, Perla. Next we have Shawn Noriega.
Thank you, and good evening, and thank you to Rocio and Patrick for organizing this. One of the things that Rocio mentioned at the beginning was, looking at Latino in the context of where does it fit in U.S. art, and I think that's a good question. What I want to do in my talk is actually try to open it up to a more global framework as well, and to look at those three registers of the individual or the individual group, the idea of a nation, and then the more universal realm when we begin thinking about the world in whatever ways we do. And one of the things that kind of, along those lines, at the same time, I want to really route that through art, through talking about art and what the art is doing. And along those lines, just really acknowledge Perla's amazing work, which we had an opportunity to show in the Home So Different, So Appealing show. And for me, personally gratifying in my catalog essay, to be able to put her work, to talk about her work, but then later on come back and put it into dialogue with Gordon Mata Clark, because they're both really coming at the same issue about housing in the same period from very different perspectives. And in this case, just a powerful body of work, and what you're doing now is just absolutely necessary to get more images circulating. I was intrigued by this work by Domingo Ulloa, Chicano artist, 1957. Actually, at the time, he would have been a Mexican artist, right? He painted that, started painting that the day that image or something similar to that image came out and hit the world. And he felt that in this moment, he had something to say as a painter to address this as a world issue. And the way he does it, I think, gets to some of the questions about the avant-garde. And this work by Maria Brito, I had all my captions and they seem to have disappeared. She's basically recreating Goya's Los Caprichos series through small ceramic figures. And what really intrigued me is then she did a summation piece in which she puts Goya and herself there on the edge in dialogue. They're the first arrivals. And what she's doing historically, what she's doing in terms of the long history of the avant-garde is really quite profound, and it's really, in some ways, speaking very broadly to a history of the West. So From there, I want to say a little bit about the show Home that I worked on with Mari Carmen Ramirez and Pilar Tompkins Rivas. And what we were trying to do was to say, hey, let's take a universal concept. Let's use Latin American and Latino artists and see what happens. Because certainly white artists have had that opportunity over and over and over. But to my mind, I've never seen the other thing happen. Not to say that an absolute commitment that that's where we have to end up, but what will happen if we do it? In a discussion with the senior curators at the museum, in which this idea was being pitched, Pilar and I pitched it, and we were just so happy, and like, look what we've done. And one of the senior curators said, you can't do that. That violates curatorial methodology. Where are the Africans? Where are the Chinese? And I very humbly suggested that I'd be interested in where they were in her last thematic show. You can't do that. What you have to do is tell us how you're different. And before I could answer, and I'm a quick responder, and I'm pretty salty, right? Before I can even say anything, she says, let me tell you how you're different. Wow. You speak Spanish at home. And I'm like, Dios mío. Can I ask you a question then? And I told the story about Rafael Montañez Ortiz, growing up in the Lower East Side, which was predominantly Jewish, and being his parents being told by the local school to don't speak Spanish at home. And by the way, we call him Ralph. That's where Ralph came from. So the show happened, greatest show in the world. Actually, it's one of the most popular shows in the world of 2017. And that's what happened. The museum did not put up any advertising. There were no banners in the street. And we had twice as many people see that show as would see other shows. Not only that, the average age was 9 years younger. Not only that, it was a much more diverse group coming into the show. So that was an impact. The fact that we got my first positive review in the New York Times was kind of a bonus. That we got an over-the-top positive review in the New Yorker was kind of really quite validating. But to realize that as a show and the impact that we had, that came about because the idea worked for all audiences. Everybody could relate to that show, and they could also come away learning more about Latino and Latin American artists without it being a didactic kind of effort, that this is what we're setting out to do. And the other thing is that those people came because of word of mouth. So I'm going to end by just very briefly talking about Rafael in terms of being an artist who really, I think many of these artists that have been mentioned, they are not only important to take account of because of their individual accomplishments or the group they belong to, but because if we really take their work into account, if we look at that work and what it's doing, it will shift the broader histories of art, whether you're talking about the avant-garde, whether you're talking about art of the West or modernist art. And here we have Rafael at the Destruction and Art Symposium, where he's one of 2 or 3 U.S. Representatives, depending on whether you count Al Hansen as still in the U.S. at that point. Here he is in that. And what is kind of fascinating to me is that, and showing him, he's 84 years old, he's still active as an artist. He was the artist with the earliest work we had from 1957. It was a recycled film that when you take the works he did in 57 and 58, it destroys the entire scholarly literature on recycled cinema as the origins of a modernist cinema in the United States and by extension in the West. Because what he's doing is not only different, it is a complete contrast to Bruce Conner, who is seen as the point of origin. Guerrilla theater. He's one of the first people really helping theorize it, along with Richard Schechner. They collaborated. They did a recreation of the Kent State Massacre. I don't know where these slides came from because they're not the ones I sent. Kent State Massacre, less than 24 hours after it happens. And what we remember, of course, is that Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young got a song on the radio 4 weeks later. And that was seen as this phenomenal turnaround because people's attention is on the mass media, not on what can happen on the ground. Along with Antonio Barni, who's an older artist, but was also producing work in the early 60s, along with Rafael, that really utterly changed it was part of a change in the nature of art away from painting and sculpture as a predominant framework to the idea of mixed media art or process-based art. Now that's usually told as a history that looks at the that looks at the European-based group, the New Realist, or at the American pop artists. And you have an artist here in Argentina and then one in New York who are really not only just, they're not following in other people's wake, they are doing their own original engagement with this idea of how do we change the nature of art to deal with the changed reality that we're in after the Second World War. And the final thing I'll say in terms of Rafael, well, very quickly, I'll just say he's an artist, and this hasn't been done, and it's something I'm trying to work on. He can completely be understood in terms of the history of music after John Cage. He is there as a contemporary. He has an influence on composers like Anea Lockwood, who are canonized at this point in terms of modernist thing. But he gave her first opportunity to work in the musical realm in 1966 in London, participating in his Piano Destruction concert. She would later then go on and do a piano concert in which the piano is dissolving in a river. So to put these figures into that dynamic, not as derivative, but as actually a way of recentering the discussions of what's happening in that realm. And the final thing is he's a pivotal figure actually in the culmination of neo-Freudian psychoanalysis in the United States in a way that where it really comes together, in which he is actually participating with the major institute in a study of creativity that comes up with new models of how we do psychoanalysis, not in terms of instincts and drives, which are mechanical, those have nothing to do with you as a person, and more psychodynamic and interpersonal approaches to psychoanalysis, which is where it gets social and political. And the institute he was involved with was very much involved in that in terms of extending psychoanalysis to the working class. An offshoot of that became a psychoanalytic cult in which Clement Greenberg was the pimp for all of the artists that were in the abstract expressionist thing, and they lived there within this cult. And another offshoot of that was primal scream therapy, which, if you can read the first part, A Man Named Ortiz, it's based on a performance that Rafael did in London in 1966. I was able to introduce Arthur Janoff before he passed away and Rafael to each other because they'd kind of shaped each other's lives and yet had never actually met in person. And it was interesting because all of Arthur Janoff's acolytes kind of were there at this meeting at his Malibu house. And we filmed it. I got the cinematographer, Fassbender, Fassbender's cinematographer to videotape this. And they treated him almost like he was the returning alien from another planet who had seeded their civilization, and so they had all these questions for him to kind of answer things they hadn't been able to resolve. So the conclusion of that is, I think that among other things, I'm not suggesting there's only one thing we need to do, but certainly one of them is to take up the task that those who control that universal narrative, that universal history of Western art, and rewrite it, because they're not going to change that. And as an example of that, I think a model would be something along the lines of what Trujillo's book, Silencing the Past, does, where he takes Haiti and says, I can tell the history of Haiti as the center of the history of the West. And he does it. And I think what we have an opportunity with figures like Rafael and other Puerto Rican artists, which is there really is the possibility of taking Puerto Rico as the center of the history of the United States since 1898. And not marginal, not subjugated. It's actually at the center of the restructuring of citizenship and sovereignty and understandings of the relationship of art to those things. And boom, that's it. That's where the story has to start. Thank you.
Thank you, Chon. Oh, this might have been the slide you were looking for.
Yeah.
And this was his last piano. Not the last one.
No, I think
one
that is
before
the, no,
most
next to
recent.
last.
He did one
next
in
to last.
LA, I thought, after.
We did one in LA that turned out to be made out of pressed wood. It was like an IKEA piano, and
Oh, no.
he hit it once, and it just went.
Oh dear. Thank you,
And it was
Chon.
only this tall because it was for grade school. It didn't look as small in the picture when we bought it.
The wrong piano. Please help me thank Chon again. Help me welcome Freddy Raviga.
Good evening. Thanks to El Museo del Barrio, Patrick, Rocio, and all of you for joining us this evening. I'm going to start from the very beginning when I arrived in New York. That was the Christmas Eve, 1963. I came with a roast pig and a case of rum because we needed to celebrate Nochebuena. So a lot of friends from Dominican Republic came to the airport to pick me up, and of course, we were up all night. It took me a while to find my way around New York because I didn't speak any English at all, and all the people that I knew also, well, kind of isolated. They didn't know that much about really how New York worked in terms of culture. Finally, I went to Herring High School in 1965, today John Jay College, and I also started attending the Art Student League. But because I didn't know anything about abstract art, I was taking figure painting with Sidney Dickinson. Then I moved back to the village. That was 1966. I wanted to live in an intellectual and artistic environment. I was there for a while, but I was doing a lot of work in the cafes, drawing people, and meeting people from all over the world who were writers, poets, and musicians, artists, everything. That was really, really motivating. But I was drafted into the Army, so I left the country. I went back to the Dominican Republic for a short time, and from there I went to Puerto Rico, and finally I came back to New York in 1968. I started going to the FIT and the New School for Social Research in 1970. And I studied geometric art with Carmen Cicero. At the time, he was doing geometric art. Now he doesn't want to tell people that he was. He wants to be known as an expressionistic artist. But it was really, really important. The other thing that was really important to me at the beginning when I went to Herring High School was my art teacher gave me a pass to go to MoMA for the whole year. And that's when I discovered Kandinsky and Mondrian. And obviously, I took side with Mondrian. Somehow, I identified with Mondrian very quickly. Also, all these courses I took at FIT, in terms of color, it was very helpful. And as you can see, this painting was on in 1969. It's one of my first paintings. When you work as a textile designer back then, which is what I was doing at FIT, you were limiting how many colors you could use in the designs because it would be very expensive. I'll do it any other way. And the title of this painting is Mother and Child. I want you to listen to me, but also to concentrate on the images that we presented. Next. This is the first, actually, you know, before this exhibition, I had an exhibition in a place called Infinity Plus One. It was a solo show, also in 1971 in Chelsea. It was an advertising agency that had a brownstone house in Chelsea. And I did an exhibition of about more than 20 paintings, geometric paintings. Then, in 1971, I joined this group exhibition. What it was really strange was I was really, really young. And some of these people have already shown at MoMA, at the Whitney Museum, at the Metropolitan Museum. So it was like, wow. And that was very, very good. Then in 1972, it was a busy year. I was in this exhibition of Latin American art, and Carmen Herrera was in that exhibition. It was at the Love Study Center at New York University. Also, Tony Bichara was there. That's when he met Carmen, and he met me. So 72 was a great, great year for that. Also, at that time, reading has been so important in my artwork from the very beginning. I actually have all these books from all these famous art critics, like John Kennedy, which probably forgotten by now. Let's see, Clement Greenberg, Harold Rosenberg, Leo Steinberg, Hilton Kramer, and many, many, many Latin American writers, mostly people who wrote fiction. And the biggest influence in my work actually is a writer, even more than Mondrian, is Julio Cortázar, because of his position politically. The reason why I came to New York was for political reason. I was trying to run away from all the problems that were happening in the Dominican Republic at the time. It was really dangerous for the young people like me that were out in the street demonstrating after the kill Trujillo in order to really claim the right to freedom and democracy. But because the people that were there after Trujillo was killed, the military that were running the country, trained by Trujillo, they would go in the street and kill you. So I finally left. I see. Well, Julio Cortázar having so important to me is because his work has always been about freedom. He left Argentina for political reason also. He moved to Paris around 1954. And then the other thing that he never wanted to do, if you're familiar with his work, that every book that he made, he wanted to be printed, published in a different format. He never stuck with one editorial because usually editorials have the same format for all the books. And Julio didn't want that. So with time, I learned through him that in order to be an artist, to be free and express yourself the way you want, you have to have control of everything. Everything, which is something that I still have today. When Perla was talking about bankruptcy in New York, it was very beneficial to me because I had a very, very nice loft. I only had to work like maybe 15 hours a month to pay the rent. And that was really, really easy. That was very helpful also to develop my work. There, in 1972, again, as I said before, it was a really good year. I was, the Aldrich Museum purchased this painting for me. Actually, they put the title wrong because the name of the painting was Cuando lo vi. And actually, Larry Aldrich, who was a fashion designer, was very supportive of the art. The other thing, I was the only Latino in this exhibition. There was nobody else. It was a big exhibition. And he also had a place in Soho, the Center for the Visual Artists on Prince Street. I also exhibited there. And Warhol was wrong. I thought it was have 15 minutes of fame, but it's only 8. So I exhibited there also, but what is something that is very curious, after he died in 2001, age around 95, the Aldrich Museum donated the painting to the Bronx Museum. Why? Can you people think why? Well, maybe segregation. But anyway, I don't have too much time to talk now. And let's see what's the next slide. This is that cheap loft that I have on 22nd Street in Chelsea. And as you can tell, it was a very good place to work. I had a front window, back windows. I could see the Empire State Building from my back. Also, in 1972, I did this painting, but I was doing geometry work all the time and doing small collages on cardboard. This is from 1972, Free the Panther. Always, I put content into my work. It's also very political. And one of the ways I did at the beginning, when I started doing my geometry painting, was by using Spanish titles on my work. Now, you can read this. This is the paintings that here are described as photographs, but they are paintings. These are the paintings that Smithsonian purchased in 2011. They were done also in, you could see it in the previous slide where I'm standing in the loft. One of these paintings on the floor. And I put, that's when I started putting really context into my work. And in this particular case, it was all about music, how finally the Latin music started to become very popular in New York, in all the groups. And
We can't see the titles because of the way the color.
okay, the one on the left is Danza Africana. The one in the middle is Amor Africano. And the one on the right is Danza de Carnaval. Now, when I went back to Dominican Republic after getting a very small award in the biennial in 1974, because in New York, people were not really paying attention too much to my work because I was basically Latino. You keep on going to galleries and showing your slide and all that, and they would say, oh, no, go someplace else. So I went to the Dominican Republic and just shown my geometric work, and they didn't understand it there. So I had this problem. Here, I was not quite accepted because of my background, and there, they didn't accept me because of my work. So I started working with more of the Dominican tradition. In this particular installation, the critic Marianne de Tolentino called la ambientación apasionante, or the passionate installation by Freddy Rodríguez. For the first time in the paper, they wrote 2 articles about an exhibition. And I used all kinds of things in it. Too bad that I couldn't record. I recorded the lottery, which is something that they play in the Dominican Republic on Sundays, and they have all these numbers. They just keep on repeating the number, blah, 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 for about 2 hours. So I play that in the exhibition. I play also the horse races, because they also became very popular, part of the sound system. And people will go by the gallery and they go crazy. They say, what's going on in here? But it became very popular. It was really known by everybody. It was a very successful exhibition from that point of view. So this is the second section of the exhibition. And part of the exhibition, I used a lot of chromolithographs from all the saints, and trying to create a combination of Catholicism with brujeria, witchcraft, or santeria. But I had a panel about 20 feet in which I made reproduction of the Mona Lisa and Jesus Christ, but they look at each other in the panel. At the end, on the right, is a manifesto about what I thought about contemporary art, including, on top of it, my ID, my cédula personal. So it was really, really, really exciting. Now, this go like 10 years later, after I came to New York. I came back from the Dominican Republic in 1976, and finally I got involved with the Latino community, because in the past I was kind of isolated from the community because I was living downtown, I was exhibiting in other things. Then I found out Galeria Cayman Gallery, and this is an installation I did in 1982. As you can see, that in some of these rows I use a lot of plastic soldiers, because part of that, I call the exhibition El Archivo de mi Memoria, my memory archives. It was about that. And you can see the bottom pieces, that's how I install it. And I continue using text in my work. Before that, I did also an exhibition there in 1978 about painting. Now, to conclude, I'd like to tell you, even though I have tried many different ways of expressing myself, I find that painting today is really challenging to do good paintings. So I stick with that. And because I'm able to put content into painting, in so many ways, even the painting are abstract. I find that really, really challenging and very exciting. Right now, I'm dealing with my research about gold, the history of gold, that has so many good things, bad things, and it's also very mysterious, the origin of it. So I have done quite a few paintings about this subject so far, about 100 of them. And I probably do some installation work, but one of the problems that I do have still is that we don't get the good spaces to show the work. And the other big problem that us Latinos have is that because we don't sell enough work, that limit the things that you can do in terms of developing all your ideas and all your creativity. Especially today, I feel very bad for young artists because they don't have any place to work. They cannot afford it. They even had to get like 3 jobs to pay the rent. So it is too bad. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. We have a good amount of time for Q&A, and I think because we're recording, if you have a question, it'd be great if you could come to the microphone so that your question can be heard for the recording.
Freddy, did you win any of the lotteries?
No, I never play. No, even in New York. I don't know if you noticed, people in New York never win.
Yeah, same in California.
Yeah, because they manipulate it. With computers, they know where they want people to win.
Just bought a ticket today.
Only buy tickets when you travel.
Yeah, Perla just bought a ticket, and Freddy's giving her the bad news. Any questions?
I was just thinking what Chon
It's not
just
working.
mentioned about the what can we do as culture producers to help Latin works, Latin culture be more accepted into the context of the U.S., to the American art. And you said something, Chon, about starting to write alternative history.
Yeah.
Undo the prevalent history. Is that what I understood?
Yeah, yeah.
So I'm just asking, this is just an open question to all the panel. If you have any other tactics or strategies that you've been thinking about that we can somehow project to work, not only for historians, but artists and cultural producers and curators, museums. I mean, is there anything practical that you see we can start doing now?
I mean, I guess I'll start with that. And I think the first thing is to realize that this idea of the art world, it's a system. It's in a series of overlapping or integrated institutions. The one that gets ignored is art schools or art departments at universities. But since the 30s, it's really been quite central because the people that go through those programs get jobs and can sustain their work independent of the art market. But it does connect with the art market, it connects with the galleries, it connects with the museums, and with the press. In LA, we have a very conservative critic. That's the only place we didn't get a review, was the major newspaper in LA. We were reviewed actually around the world in that sense. So I think it's to understand that there's that system in place and that we're largely not part of it. And any effort to intervene in any one point, say as curators, you have to create something that's not there. I mean, I helped set up a program at LACMA and now 5 other comprehensive art museums to bring minority undergraduates in to be mentored by museums, not to do somebody's grunt work for 10 weeks in the summer, which is part of the program, but for the other 42 weeks to be mentored and to be given a stipend so you don't have to work, you can spend your time there. That is intervening in something that is functioning quite well, just not for Black, Latino, Asian American, or Native American. So you know, I don't have like that comprehensive answer. I just know that I try to think in terms of what I can do, where can I intervene? And every show that I've done over the last almost 30 years, I've always had a question of what can we do to kind of push here? I'd done 2 shows at LACMA, the LA County Museum of Art, and I said, but what about this? Can we take this approach? And it was an uphill struggle each way, but there was also support that I found. The history thing, I mean, I'll end with that. It is so important to get critical discourse, whether it is popular or academic, out there on individual artists. We have enough surveys of what Latino, I mean, articles. There's not enough books. There could be a few more books that at least just survey and prove the fact of, which is what these books often do. It's what the Radical Women show did in terms of just saying, boom, here, you can't ignore them because we did the exhibition, we did the book, and now this has to be a reference point. But we need so much more of that, and particularly at the level of individual artists where you have you know, people like Freddy or Perla or so many artists that really have done profound work, may even be pretty well recognized outside of their immediate area, and yet don't have a single scholarly article that engages with their career or with an individual work of art that they've done. So I think that that's really a key area. I mean, we're slowly seeing curators come in, but it's not enough. There has to be more. I don't know if anybody else has this.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. And I want to, Chon, what you said, you didn't give yourself enough credit. You've mentored an incredible amount of young curators who are now our peers in the field. And that's super important. And Yasmin is teaching a class on Latinx art. I mean, that's one of the first, right? I mean, there's not enough teaching in the area, right? So we need to keep inspiring younger students and scholars and giving them there's no bibliographies, there's no syllabuses, you know, like we need to create this and give it to people, you know, mentoring people at El Museo del Barrio that are now our peers in the field. Like it's incredibly rewarding. And we need, and somebody said at the last panel, so I'm going to say it again because I think it's terrific, we need to keep citing each other. That's
even if we're arguing.
Even if we're arguing, but we need to keep like citing because that's how it gets into the discourse is by this through the citation, through the writing, through the work, through the shows, through the catalog. So,
one of the strategies that I'll be doing in my book, not major, but when there is the opportunity, it's a tactic. Part of the X in Latinx, the unknown, is room for African Americans and Euro-Americans and Asians who are looking at Latino culture, who have contributed to our culture, to be also included. I mean, we won't demonstrate that we have real impact in the world unless we're conversing with people other than ourselves. I want to see predominantly Latino shows, but not exclusively Latino exhibitions, because I think that limits the real exchange that goes on day to day with artists and the rest of the world. I mean, yeah, we do live in our barrios, but we also go out and we also engage with other people, and other people find us fascinating, and so why not make a little bit more of that and mix it up. I really want, so like someone like Martin Wong will be in my book. Alice Neal is in my book. Why? Because between Martin Wong and Alice Neal, no one was painting the Puerto Rican community in the 1940s like she did. She married 2 Latino men. I mean, so it's, for me, she's part, and she has Latino children, so why shouldn't we acknowledge that she was and lived in El Barrio much longer? I've never lived in El Barrio, you know. So if they're artists that are really integrated in our community and have contributed, let's also acknowledge their existence, because let's not do what they do to us.
Can I just say also to your question, that's one of the reasons I think it's so important to have artists on the panel with the historians and the curators, because here you have 2 perfect examples of stories that need to be told in the next generation of scholars. Hopefully students who are in the audience will become enamored of Freddy and Perla. And you could write an article about each of those two presentations and talk about their crucial role in the 1960s and 70s in the New York City art scene, right? In conversation with other artists working at the time who were not necessarily Latinx.
I wanted to add to the what can we do, and it wasn't said, but I know that in your work, Yasmin, and some of you were involved with other artists, right? Like what made El Museo del Barrio, Taller Boricua, MOCA, all these institutions where artists getting together, finding spaces, and creating alternative worlds, right? And I know that there's a lot of young people here, and I'm guessing that many of you are artists, right? And I think that that's one thing that, you know, I really am hopeful of new generations of artists. I've been going to a lot of exhibitions in the Bronx at the Longwood Gallery. I know Juanita's there. And when you go to those spaces, you know, and you see, you know, all these like Dominican, Puerto Rican, Ecuadorian, you know, all these kinds of, because Latinx, you know, when we tend to think of Latinx as this kind of like, Latinx, no. You know, to me, it's a space around which to think about, you know, all the racial, ethnic, generational within the Latinidad that it's, you know, that needs exploring. And I find that exhibitions in the Bronx, the Bronx Art Center, are doing really, really that. And I wonder if those artists that are young, that are participating in those networks, in Instagram, I'm learning about all these networks. I'm like, why, you know, of course, you know, it's impossible to find the cheap rents, right? To find the spaces that facilitated a lot of that organizing in the 60s and the 70s. But I wondered if you could speak to models that were so central, right? That started very small and that led to these bigger institutions, because that could inspire some of the people here in the audience to galvanize and organize and begin to become, ¿cómo se dice? You know, like the ASCO 4, you know, or the Taller Body, you know, like the kind of the branded group thing that I think can actually take this thing by the horn and begin to make a mark, right, of what younger generations of Latinos are doing, so.
Anybody on the panel going to comment on that, or?
Yeah, it's right on.
One of the things that I wanted to bring up, because, you know, we're staring at this slide that's up there that has Caiman Gallery on there, and it really drives home for me, especially the conversation that, you know, that we've had so far, the fragility of the Latino effort to get recognition for Latino culture in this country, and to open the doors, you know, like. Certainly, when we look at Caiman Gallery, which was the outgrowth of Friends of Puerto Rico, and which eventually leads to the Museum MOCHA, the Museum of Contemporary Hispanic Art. And even now, if we think about what is the status of El Museo del Barrio here in New York City, one of the largest Latino populations in the United States, it is fragile. It's on a thin thread line. You know, I did an analysis of funding patterns from the city to El Museo del Barrio over the past 7 years. And I was shocked to see how marginalized that funding is. At a time when the city overall budget grew by $30 million, the funding for El Museo went down in that same period. So, you know, it's really something that, you know, the effort to try to institutionalize and make our, you know, cultural organizations healthy, the effort to get larger mainstream institutions to acknowledge our culture. Yes, progress is being made. I loved to see Carmen Herrera at the Whitney Museum. And, you know, we're seeing this happening in other areas and institutions around there, but we still have a long way to go. And especially when, you know, it starts at the top. You got a president that gets on a podium and over the weekend has a rally and says, are there any Hispanics here? You know? I mean, talking about the marginalization and the, you know, and the ostracization of Latinos in this country is just intensified. So I wondered if the panelists could you know, reflect a little bit about, you know, it's deja vu all over again, right? This is as bad as, or even worse than it was in the 60s when we were completely invisible.
No, we're worse because the population is so much larger, but the level of access has not changed. And I think something that, you know, what you're saying and what Deb said, I mean, what struck me is that, you know, we know that we're pretty much invisible on television. And we think about the commercial networks and the cable and now Netflix and all of that. But it's actually worse on public television. And if you think about, we know we're underrepresented in the major galleries and museums. It's even worse in art history departments, including public universities. So there's a level of underrepresentation there that is where the access essentially stops. And I think it's important to kind of pull up that information. I'm having a hard time with my university because they're having a centennial campaign. They wanted to promote the center, and I sent them a page and a half of what we've done in the arts. And they said, well, can you substantiate any impact? And I was like, I just spent a page and a half doing that, you know? And I realized, you know, I'll end up having to beat them over the head, and then they'll go, well, you're so aggressive. And, you know, I have a you know, employee who's white, actually, and she saw this, and at first it was just like, oh, how are we going to answer this? And then about an hour later, I get an email, I'm really angry. And I just typed back, I said, well, welcome to my world. And so, you know, my response is going to be, in the last 10 years, we have done more Chicano Latino exhibitions at large museums than the large museums of Los Angeles combined. That's the impact that we've had, right? But you do that, and it's immediately a conflict. You're calling them on something. But I think in some ways you have to just go through it. It's not personal. You have to just get the facts out there and begin working on the basis of the facts. I've just gone through the departments at UCLA, and there are 30 departments without a single Latino faculty member. There are 15 with only one, or some only have a half. I'm not sure how that happens, but but they've figured out how to cut us in half, right? So I think, you know, you mentioned our current moment of being post-truth. You know, we went from post-racial to post-truth. And I think we have to just start with the fact that that's an acknowledgement that we're not telling the truth. And so it's important to really just get that information out there. So.
There was a question in the back.
Yeah, just to that point, right quickly, I want to give credit to Latino organizations, the CCADI and Loisaida, who actually have been on the front of pushing for funding for cultural institutions of the African diaspora and the Latino community. So this is really just recently, you know, putting a lot of pressure on the city council on how they spend $150 million unevenly throughout the city. So Marta Morena was definitely in there. She's even credited to adding into the cultural plan the equity aspect, which wasn't even in there, this cultural plan for the city of New York. So she's kind of been pushing all along. So credit to the Latino and communities here in New York for continuing that work, but we definitely need more people involved in helping shape that. And to my next question, or my next question is more vague, and it's about labor. And I'm wondering what back then in the 60s and 70s and even now, if you can reflect on the issue of labor, because when it's at the 50th anniversary for the strikes in San Francisco, the student strikes, and one of the demands was for like 20 or 50 faculty, Black and Latino faculty, which people overlook that aspect of jobs in their demands. And in the East Coast, I only found maybe Howardina Pendel at MoMA advocating for more workers' rights. So I'm wondering what was the connection to the labor within the cultural industry or labor in general in the 60s, and how do you feel about it now, given the certain situations happening on the hiring of in the city museums here?
I have not much to say because, as I mentioned before, it was so easy to survive in the 70s as an artist. And also, one thing that I never wanted to do was to teach, because I think it's a very serious and demanding profession, and you have to be really, really honest about it. Yeah. And that would take away from my art. One of the good things about being full-time artist was that I was able to paint every day. I was able to go to museum, galleries all the time, do a lot of reading about history, also meet with colleagues, other artists, and just talk about art exhibitions that were going on. And that's how you learn. That's how you get better. I always see myself as someone who needs to keep learning new things and be able to put that into my art also. So I don't know, I know by things that I read, know by my own experience how people are today in terms of labor. I think things are really, really tough, especially for minority people.
Well, I mean, I'm sure most of you know that Taller Boricua grew out of activism connected with the Art Workers Coalition, and the Art Workers Coalition was pretty much a union of artists. It was an informal union. It was a union of diverse groups of artists, an umbrella organization. But that is the organization that made a great deal of change between 1969 and 1971. And actually beyond, because Lucy Lepard, they had this wonderful newspaper. Remember that Art Workers newspaper? And even after the art workers stopped doing activism, Lucy Lepard continued with this newspaper, and there was they actually covered quite a bit of African American and Asian shows. So when you want to look at the history in the 70s and exhibitions by artists of color, you would probably look at the Art Workers newspaper, and you'll get a broader understanding of what criticism was like. Because, I mean, Lucy Lepard's a very well recognized critic, but she dedicated her practice, a part of her practice, to this smaller newspaper. So when you're doing the research, you're not going to find us in a lot of catalogs in the mainstream. You have to do a little digging, and especially in the 1960s and 70s, because that is like pre-internet. So if there's we're not pre-Latinx, but we're sure are pre-internet. And so you have to have a very different way of doing your research. And I know it's a real drag. I have students, I myself am guilty. If it's not on the internet, I'm not really gonna go to the library, but to do this work, you've gotta get away from your computer and into the streets and the libraries and the archives.
One comment I wanted to make when Freddie was talking about being able to afford performance space or a painting space. I live in Hell's Kitchen, and Hell's Kitchen in Chelsea, and of course down in Soho, they used to have these wonderful spaces because being that it was kind of the capital of prostitution and drug dealing, you had a lot of spaces. And I am now, just before I went on the road to do some work, I was trying to apply to the new cultural center that is opening in
The Shed?
The Shed. And I read the staff and the board and everything, and I'm going, I actually started the grant with, given that there is no representation in a community where, you know, we were Irish people and Puerto Ricans living in cold water flats for so long in this area, and now we're one of the most expensive neighborhoods you can move into, $1 million apartments, insane, and you're building a cultural center, and you're an open call for artists. I don't know how to write the grant because I'm so frustrated. I'm like, what am I writing? Do you know what I'm talking about? So I submitted it, but it was very frustrating because I felt like it was even more modern than Lincoln Center, and no representation whatsoever on that board or on that staff. Or
yeah, it's super elitist.
It's So not for it to be a downer, because I'm sure we'll find other spaces, but I was kind of excited, and I didn't get to read the whole article about decolonization of art in the Brooklyn Museum.
Oh, you decolonize the space?
Yeah,
What about it?
well, I almost feel like that has to be everywhere. It's like every time there's an open call, okay, let's answer it back as, are we decolonizing here, or finally? Or, anyway, it's not an answer, I'm just commenting on that.
There's another question.
Hi, thank you for the panel. It was wonderful. I wanted to just a brief commentary before I pose my question about what you were commenting on Lucy Lippard. A fun fact is that Lucy Lippard has claimed in more than one occasion that she discovered the possibility for conceptualism and for art in general to be political during a visit to Argentina when she saw the preparations of Tucumán Arde, which is an activist labor collective action that took place actually in a union. So the relationship in between, we can maybe at least jokingly claim that Lucy Lippard learned that from Latin America. About one question, I'm doing my dissertation on Latin American artists living in New York between 1965 and 75. And my case studies are mostly artists who came from South America, many of which you named, Deborah, in your presentation. And a question that I get all the time, and that I don't know yet how to answer, is whether they are Latino or not. And I've been posing that question to my artists, the ones that are still alive and I can interview, and they don't know the answer either. And I was wondering maybe if you can share what you would think about that.
Yeah, that's something I think about a lot, actually. And it's the relationship of identity to artistic practice. I started studying film, and I write about film, but I moved into the visual arts, and talking with most of these artists, whether they're filmmakers or painters or what have you, and I'd ask what they wanted to be called, and they always said, an artist, right? I was like, wow, that's, because the curators all want to put you in a category. Now they're doing it in a positive way, but it's the same category as the museums that don't want to show your work, right? Those categories are almost identical. And that's not to say there's not something valuable happening within those shows, but we can't describe it with the category. We have to describe it by getting in there and looking at the work and seeing what the contradictions are, as well as what the alignments are. So my approach is to kind of, in dealing with this, because I write about people, you know, people have identities and they change a lot. They have a lot of contradictions in them. And in all ways, you know, an identity is situational and in the moment. And so I try to recognize those. And to really keep conscious of that I'm really trying to identify something that's happening, not a pre-existing category into which you can drop something. And it's really difficult, because it's a lot easier to do that. Everybody's going to agree with you, whether it's because now they know not to show your work or because now they can include it in what they do. And I'll just end by saying, you know, the last show I did is called Home, So Different, So Appealing. It's language coming from Richard Hamilton's pop art piece in the late 50s. It's used by a Colombian artist where he does that made out of coca leaves. And he's doing something very specific, right? He's trying to say that you are looking at this and it's telling you that the primary exchange between Colombia and the United States is between the drug cartels and the upper middle class that buys those magazines that Richard Hamilton was parroting. And it's there in the room with you. It's not just an idea. It's not just hearsay, you can touch it, right? Except the museum guards won't let you. So we wanted to have that as a title, not have Chicano, Latino, Latino X, all of that in there. And the people we had to fight with was the museum, because it didn't fall into a category. And the only things that can exist outside of a category are those that have universal entitlement. And we weren't that. We had to fight, and we ended up, it was kind of like, you know, the 1898 Treaty of Paris or something. We ended up with this document in which, you know, it wouldn't be on the wall going into the museum. It wouldn't be on the catalog, because damn it, I was editing it, you know. But there would be a subtitle added to the press release, which is Art of the Americas since 1957, right? Because there was just this incredible anxiety about something going out there in which people don't know what it is. And I posed the question, I said, so, you have a lot of people come to the museum. How many of them want to see Latino art? How many of them want to see Latin American art? Because there are those people. Is that the mainstay of your audience? Well, no, it's actually a very small part of our audience. Then why do you want to advertise this that way when that's not what the show is doing?
But Chon, I'm sorry, I listened to this conversation because I'm also writing about
Yeah.
this question. And I think that, what we need to foreground is class
Mhm.
and race.
Mhm.
Because New York City has always been a global city that has attracted people from all over the world, right? To be more mobile artists. And when I look at the artists that you mentioned, many of them, were just wanted to be European artists. Many of them, in terms of like the trajectories, which to me is kind of very different than what happened, with the irregular movement that began to say, fuck that tradition.
Mhm.
We're going to do a very different tradition that actually goes into the African, all that stuff.
Mhm.
That's with activism. So I think with the question that, I'm because it's not about essentialism,
Mhm.
because a lot of those artists will never be called themselves Latino because to them it's like those people, and that happens a lot too. The LALA right now,
Mhm.
the City Standard was a showcase of class and race and nationality, and how that impacts which
Mhm.
artists want to identify and articulate and learn more from.
Mhm.
Because I'm not saying that Latin American artists that are here,
Mhm.
whether it is for 10 years or 20 years, to me it's not a matter of how long you've been here, but what is your articulation around race, class, or identity, and
Mhm.
the project that you identify with, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think that that's really, it's more of it's not an essentialist position, but it's one that really foregrounds, right, matters of race, race and class, that oftentimes get enlightened when we
Mhm.
get into this lapping thing that everybody's lapping, right? And then it's like, no, there is political projects that some of us want to disavow ourselves from because we want to be, we have different alignments. So it's not about, it's a more fluid thing, but I think that, unless we put race and class on the foreground, we're going to continue going in circles.
Yeah, and I'm not saying don't address those things. In fact, the show is really very much about that. And it's really, yeah. Yeah, so my response is that in this particular show, of all of the exhibitions I've done, this was really a strategy. It was very calculated to just occupy that space and to kind of play that. But, these artists very much have cultural, political, racial identities that are very much informing the work that they have. So this is really how do we package that? But I agree entirely that these things have to be in there. Most of the shows that we see at the major museums should say, by white upper middle class men. Mm-hmm. An exploration of,
By white European, white upper class Latin American artists.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But
Which is, so I think that we need to foreground that, otherwise to make these kind of connections, we're going to.
I think these are really important issues that you're raising, Arlene, and as you know, I'm super interested in race and class, but I think it's equally as essentialist to say we have to foreground that. We have to foreground the art, like for me, like whatever you're interested in. I think there's various types of art, different people are interested at different times, and I think it's a disservice to some of the artists to say they just want to be European artists. Like I think that's a really sort of unfair comment. But to get to what you were saying, I mean, I probably I don't know, I totally disagree maybe with Yasmin, but that's fine because we can do that. I agree with all the categories. Like I think, it's completely situational. I think whatever works, use it. Like if we're going to talk about Chemnitzer, we're going to say he's Latin American, we're going to say he's American, we're going to say he's a printmaker, he's German, or he's a conceptual artist. Like whatever works, we use it because it's complex. Like Yasmin said, like no one lives in a vacuum, right? So everyone's like talking to each other and doing different things. And so I sort of have never asked an artist what they want to be called. I would rather call them, Yasmin or whatever. I wouldn't, I don't, but we have to use these handles, I understand, to define it to someone to give a handle, because people like to know what you're talking about, to get a little window in, but that is not all we should use.
Well, I mean, I use the example of how they call themselves or how people call them, just for the sake of posing the question. But I mean, the very hairy situation that I find all the time in my dissertation is the functioning of these agencies and communities, which, as Amelia was pointing out, have a lot of race and power complications, which I'm not trying to say that one was better than the other, but these were communities that were a little bit communicated, but so far I haven't found a lot of communication, and I wish I could find more, because then we could find bridges between these histories and these worlds, but also understanding the differences between these other worlds.
And yeah, and there's worlds and worlds, right? There always are, yeah.
And everybody's always operating in multiple ones. I mean, Chemnitzer was operating with the Latin American activists, Irish groups that he was contesting the American society, but he was also playing within radio scene, and then and there he was more in contact with the regenerative. So you have all these multiple agencies, but I don't know. I guess I wanted to bring this topic up.
No, it's a super important topic. Thank you.
I wanted to give a brief comment. I just returned from Alabama, where I covered the opening of 2 museums. One actually is a memorial. This covers the question of race. There's a lawyer, Brian Stevenson, who has done some marvelous work trying to defend black African Americans who are on death row, because almost always it's sadly men of color, and many of them, after being executed, have been found that they were not guilty. So he created a museum called the Legacy Museum that shows the beginning of slavery through Jim Crow all the way into mass incarceration, and the explanation of all the laws that led up to that. It's quite fascinating. But the other one, the memorial, is actually the Lynching Museum, which represents 4,000 human beings that were lynched that they know of. And he could not get it approved, even though it's, they owned the property and all of that. Montgomery, Alabama, which is where it's situated, would not allow them to call it the Lynching Museum. So it is called the Peace and Justice Memorial. It's astounding. I mean, I cried halfway through it, and then finally could settle down and and photograph it. But I was amazed that you couldn't even name it what it is. So I took myself on a quick little side tour to a plantation. I had to, because I'm working on an Afro-descendant photo project and some other things. And you look at the tour guide takes you through this, nice little house, and you look at the writing, and it says the servants and the workers, and the little house that's outside, the tenant lived here. And I looked at the woman, because there was a young woman with her 2 children, and I said, "Are you referring to all the slaves? Because I don't understand the word workers and laborers and what was the other word? Workers, laborers.
Tenant.
Oh, the tenant. What tenant? And she looked at me and she said, "Oh, well, that's what they called them." And I did it for the 2 little girls that were there, that I was hoping they would ask their mother, why did that lady say they were all slaves? Because I was blown away. And but then again, I was in Alabama. I haven't been in Alabama before, so. But if you get a chance to see the memorial, it is about 16 acres. It is astounding, the work they did. It's hard to say it's beautiful in something so, but the architect just did a phenomenal job. But it has an unusual name.
I wished we had all night to speak, but we are really, really out of time. If people have more questions, you can come and add the panelists. But please help me thank them all for their time. They're brilliant.